First of all, good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here with you, sharing part of my work. I'm very honored. I want to extend special thanks to the organizers and especially to Tanya Keki. And well, I'm going to read my presentation. Its title is Naming the Witch on Violence and Mimesis. Social forces seem always to exhibit retroversive causality, precisely because they necessarily involve signification, meaning, or interpretation. Molly and Shullenberger explain it using Italo Calvino's story A Beautiful March Day, and the senators who damned the Caesar as a tyrant, arguing that killing him was the only way to liberate Rome. In the logic, we find the most common gesture of every political program. Identify a problem, locate its cause, and then eliminate that cause to solve the problem. But killing Caesar not only eliminates the tyrant, it changes the conditions by which that action acquires its meaning. The very world in which it made sense to get rid of Caesar also vanishes with those dagger strokes. Not because Caesar held that world together, but because the assassins could not foresee that their act would also transform the way the act itself would later be judged, even by themselves. Neither they nor anyone else could predict or govern how the future would interpret the assassination. Put another way, we could say that there was simply no way for them to take into account the retroversive effect of future interpretations. Being in a social situation implies being subject to the retroactive effects through which new ways of meaning can be attributed. This openness is one of the examples of how, in the social dimension, there is an excess. The retroactive effects of social relations means that each thing, action, or subject is not exhausted in its current social identity, in its properties and relations, but that there always remains in them a plus of indeterminacy, and precisely for that reason they can signify in new ways. Although it may seem paradoxical, it is this excess that makes the systematicity of the social field possible. We can never be sure what others think of us, but this inability is precisely what makes it necessary for us to continue to participate in the social field. Because the social field is the only place in which we can attempt to elucidate what we mean to ourselves and to others. Excess is simultaneously what prevents us from knowing what we truly mean, even for ourselves, and the necessary ingredient of the social field for us to have meaning, no matter how uncertain. Current theories seem to be aware of this excess, by they contemplate it as an obstacle to ensure knowledge or psychic or social stability. The social has to be continually produced by countless acts of interpretation to mean or make things mean in a particular way, even if we can never be sure we have succeeded, even if we do so with constructions of relationality. What matters is how others and ourselves appropriate the meaning of what we say and do. Without the possibility of appropriation, the social would not exist. We know that we have some meaning for some others. Perhaps we wish to mean something specific for them. However, we lack the power to ensure that they will think of us in exactly the way we want them to. Michael Taussig describes what he himself called the unconscious skill of dissimulation as follows, and quoting Taussig. We act and have to act as if mischief were not afoot in the kingdom of the real, and not that all around the ground lay field. That is what the facticity of the social fact, being a social being, is all about. No matter how sophisticated we may be, as to the arbitrary and constructive character of our practices, including our practices of representation. Our practice of practices is one of active forgetting. Try to imagine. What would happen if we didn't in daily practice conspire to actively forget what Saussure called the arbitrariness of design, end of the quote. Indeed, we could ask it was, sorry, I missed one. It is precisely the excess we conceive that allow us to conspire in different ways, by seeking to permanently secure the favor of others, by disengaging ourselves from some issues and involving ourselves in others, by turning to the stabilizing power of the stereotypes and social codes, or by enjoying the contingency of the creation and circulation of social meanings. In any case, it is the unconscious skill of dissimulation that makes it so that, although we can never be sure, we continue to participate in the social field, because the social field is the only place where we can try to elucidate what things mean and what we mean, however precarious, to us and to others. This opens them and opens us to new possibilities, so that the familiar can suddenly become illusory strange. According to Freud, the uncanny cannot be dissociated from the homely, the familiar. The uncanny would be the familiar that becomes strange. There are people and things, impressions, processes, and situations capable of awakening in us with particular intensity the feeling of the uncanny. For example, the motive of the double and repetition. Freud gave the following example based on his own experience. Traveling in a train compartment, the door leading to the bathroom opens, and an old gentleman in bedclothes enters, before whom he feels immediate disgust. What Freud has seen, however, inadvertently, is his own image, projected in the mirror of the connecting door. It is a version of himself that he dislikes. For Freud, it is the vestige of an archaic reaction that perceives the double as the uncanny. Nothing would have happened if his own image had passed completely unnoticed, or if he had recognized it as such. The uncanny has to do with the fact that, in this case, faced with a version of himself, he does not recognize himself and even feels disgust. Indeed, we could ask if what Freud glimpses is that plus of indeterminacy that causes him not to be exhausted in his social identity. This plus of indeterminacy is what is disturbing. In the double, we see ourselves stripped of the significance that only being with and before others give us, and we see ourselves open to the indeterminacy. Hence the strangeness before an image that nevertheless is our own. Repetition, according to Freud, would be linked to the impulse of automatism, to the compulsive repetition that would dominate the psychic life of the unconscious, with no other objective than repetition itself, and that has enough power to bend the pleasure principle. What we glimpse in it is the strangeness that will depend on a process of signification which cannot be stabilized, which has no other objective than the process of signification itself. Quoting Freud, when one encounters the number 62 several times in the same day and is forced to observe that everything bearing a numerical designation, addresses, the hotel room, etc., presents the same number over and over again, one finds this persistent return uncanny. End of the quote. For Heidegger, the uncanny is the most original phenomenon from the existential ontological point of view, although it remains regularly foreseen in the everyday. It occurs when Dasein, the being in the world, habitually immersed in the everyday concerns, is given over to the unhomeliness of its existence in the world. It can happen when, like Freud, we momentarily fail to recognize our own image and contemplate our own excess, or as when, in a singular moment, we encounter several times the same number and a process of signification that signifies with no other finality than itself. The uncanny refers us to the virtual potentialities of signification. What is not only what it is. There is significant indetermination that allows it to signify. This gives a spectral character to reality. We can usually articulate this experience in a common horizon, even if only partially and subject to contestation. By naming the witch, following the steps of James Zenia, I mean the ways in which excess and indeterminacy produce an affective effervescence that is actualized so that different forms of violence arise, by naming an enemy or an opponent, a witch hunt can then be unleashed. In his Witchcraft, Magic and Oracles Among the Ascended of 1937, Evans Pritchard warns the reader that witchcraft provides a natural philosophy whereby which relations between men and unfortunate events are explained. The nature of witchcraft among the Ascended of Southern Sudan begins by explaining an accident. Sometimes a barn falls down. There is nothing surprising about that. Every Sunday knows that the termites eat the support and that the hardest wood deteriorates after years of use. But why did it have to collapse at that particular moment when these particular people were sitting under it? Evans Pritchard then clarifies that there are available and stereotypied means of reacting to such events. This assertion has implied an anthropological trend that until very recently has, broadly speaking, privileged the social function of witchcraft. A more or less accepted disciplinary version would be the following. An accident occurs for no special reason and affects our life. Witchcraft serves to name that accident and ensure that it has an origin. What happens for no reason and therefore seems to come from nowhere is recovered for social life ambiguously by helping to reinforce the belief that death or misfortune are external to the normal course of life. The first difficulty with this interpretation arises when we realize that there is a gap between the singular accident and the general explanation of misfortune. Indeed, the accident, as Evans Pritchard emphasized, is singular. What interests me is not why the barn fell down. I know that the termites eat the support. What I want to know is why it fell down on Peter, and why it had to be precisely when Peter was there. The explanation does not refer to the specific case of Peter, but is general. Between the singularity of the event and the generality of the explanation, there is necessarily a gap. To name a witch is to bring a signifier into play that makes it possible to temporarily suture this discrepancy. But it does not mean that society succeeds and fully integrates what disturbs it. Firstly, because as I have pointed out, accident and death are still seen as alien to the normal course of life. Secondly, because in the world of the Ascended, anyone and everyone can be a witch and harm the others. In fact, one can be one without knowing it. In the Sunday world, one suspects incessantly that others and oneself are never what they claim to be, even to themselves. There is an indeterminacy that causes the binding affect to be suspicion, and the name of the witch, instead of stopping suspicion, feeds it. The theory of the social function of witchcraft would then be seriously questioned. It would be a failed attempt to deal with an excess in the social order. Witchcraft would not consist on a rational deployment of functions, but would express the opposite. How society constructs and manages its own condition of possibility, the need to meet and live with others, and also its own impossibility, in this case, that of a suspicion linked to an indeterminacy that it is impossible to put an end to. In The Sorcerer and His Magic, Lévi-Strauss clarifies the very vague and poorly elaborated attitudes which for each of us possess the character of experiences remain intellectually shapeless and affectively unbearable unless this or that floating scheme is incorporated into them in the culture of the group, the assimilation of which is the only thing that allows them to be objectified. Among the Sunni of New Mexico, a boy is accused of witchcraft and forced to confess. After initially pleading not guilty and his first confession not being sufficiently convincing, he must make a second confession that is credible to the group. To do so, he must tell a story that helps to corroborate the accusation. It can be noted about that persecuted for sorcery and thus threatened with capital punishment, the accused does not win acquittal by apologizing, but by vindicating his alleged crime. Moreover, he strengthened his case by presenting successive versions, each one richer, more detailed, and in principle, therefore, more guilty than the preceding one. The story gradually captures him and his listeners, so that in the process he is transformed from guilty into a collaborator of the accusation. Thanks to him, sorcery and the ideas associated with it escape their painful mode of existence in consciousness as a diffuse set of ill-formulated feelings and representations to become incarnate in a concrete presentation. Levi-Strauss notes that although the fate of the sorcerer in Zenia's society is to be executed, the boy is forgiven because, I'm quoting him, he brings to the group a satisfaction in truth, infinitely denser and richer than the satisfaction in justice that his execution would have brought. End of the quote. Thanks to Matilda Cox-Stevenson's description, on which Levi-Strauss himself relies, we know, however, that the boy was almost killed, and that it was the colonial authority and not his community that prevented. We also know that sorcerers continued to be executed among the Sunni. For Levi-Strauss, it is a matter of restoring the coherence lost when social life is affected by an unformulary impression. What he does not say is that the sorcerer who presents himself to the community, with some exceptions, is executed, to be subsequently replaced by another sorcerer who, in turn, when the time comes, will be executed. What Levi-Strauss shows us unwillingly is the affirmation of an excess that fails to be reconducted. That is, that the power of articulation shown in the accusation of witchcraft does not ensure, as he declares, a social satisfaction in truth. The Sunni sorcerer is named by the community. He assumes the name sorcerer, and through his story he convinces the others that he is one. Among the Sunni, in an instant, everything depends on a boy being accused of being a sorcerer and being able to speak as such. Levi-Strauss argues that in this process it is a matter of the accused sorcerer becoming the voice of the community. Being the voice of the community implies saying what the community intends to be said. Apparently, the boy is the voice of the community because the intention of what he says belongs to the community. It must be remembered that he is not a sorcerer before he is designated as such. He is forced to make up a magical story. His words are not his own. In the first instance, it's true, they are the product of group coercion. He is led to a point where he does not recognize himself, but also where the others, especially the warriors, allow them to be fully absorbed. The boy, writes Levi-Strauss, was deeply absorbed in the subject. At times, his face lit up with the satisfaction resulting from the mastery he exercised over his audience. Propitiated by them, the boy's speech nevertheless leaves them astonished. The boy himself becomes more and more fascinated with a story in which the admission of guilt forced him to recognize himself as a sorcerer and murderer, possessor of immense magical force, although it's most likely that in thus recognizing himself, his fate will be his own execution. Confronted with the discursive articulation of a power that cannot be subdued by their power, the warriors will yearn for murder. But this power is particularly reluctant. It cannot be reduced. Other sorcerers emerge and new executions are demanded. Faced with the boy's story, all, including him, are under access that no one seems to control. The boy's voice belongs to him and does not belong to him. It belongs to him because it's his voice, but it does not belong to him because it is rather he who seems to belong to a story that possesses him. Nor is the voice or the voice of the community as Levi-Strauss wants, because the community itself is drawn into the discourse and recognizing it a force that excels it. representations which remain so unless we incorporate them into this or that floating scheme. We could say that this formless set has to do with indeterminacy and excess, with the restlessness it arouses, that reminder that makes that neither people nor the world are exhausted in the meanings which we usually know them. When I ask myself about the floating schemes of which Lévi-Strauss speaks, about how is that they work, I am reminded of the schemes of Kantian transcendental imagination. For Kant, schematism, a product of the transcendental imagination, is the condition of applicability of the pure concepts of understanding to the intuitions of sensibility. If space is the form that defines a region of the sensible, time is the form that defines everything external and internal sensible, for the simple reason that everything sensible refers to sensation, and every sensation, being a state of the mind, belongs to internal sensibility and is subject to the form of time. Nothing can be given in experience that it is not found immediately or mediately in time. The task of the imagination consists in traversing and linking the sensible impressions given in time, allowing not only phenomena to be thought of as substance, cause, etc., but also phenomena being actually a substance, a cause, etc. The scheme that allows a substance to be a substance is that of permanence in time. Substance is a substratum that remains. Permanence does not consist in the fact that what I perceive is the same as what I perceived before, but in the fact that in conceptualizing this new experience, I apply the same concept as before, even though I inscribe new data. I understand that the appropriate way to conceptualize my intuition of change is to apply the same concept before and after. Through imagination, the concepts of the understanding are used to connect particular aspects of the sensory manifold with other remembered or possible experience they resemble. However, in order to understand floating schemes, it may be more useful to talk about quasi-transcendentals. Quasi-transcendentals are elements of empirical experience or of a scientific discourse that serve to unify the regions of or disciplines of modern knowledge and to identify the attributes or conditions of human nature. For Foucault, one can suspect that the pure concepts of understanding and the Kantian forms of sensibility are quasi-transcendentals, that is, associated to a concrete historical and anthropological experience. There is no transcendental that does not in some way take its shape from the empirical phenomena it supposedly coordinates and reveals. In mythologies, bards argue that the concept of man, that here we could use as a quasi-transcendental, serves to justify a supposed shared human experience that he claims is a myth. The special trick of a myth is to present an ethos, ideology, or set of values as if it were a natural condition of the world, when in fact it's no more than another limited man-made perspective. The myth of man serves to naturalize injustice like colonization by identifying their own aesthetic attitudes and economic interests with man. The mythical referent of all language, the bourgeoisie, gave a necessary, natural, and bending face to their social and economic power. Althusser, for his part, drew upon the analysis school to argue that intellectual and materially productive activities were among the layers of series of historical phenomena like natural and political events. The rates of changes and observation characterizing this series could not be directly compared, so no one could claim to encompass history as a single continuum. For Althusser, as for Foucault, the idea of man was a product of forces arising from many points in the historical field and giving them a provisional frame of comparison. However, Althusser also believed that insofar as historical activities could be grasped at any given point in time as a structure, an intellectual act which alters centrally their performance and which he, unlike the analysis historians believed was inevitable, causal priority should be given given to the economic domain rather than to man. Foucault disagreed that priority needed to be assigned at all. Unlike Kantian a priori schemes, which are universal representations and do not change, we can think of imagination schemes more modestly than the quasi-transcendental ones, which encompass more, following Rogozinski, as simply historical a priori schemes. These schemes do not come from experience, they are its condition of possibility. However, they are not archetypes. They are born in the course of history and history transformed and integrated into concrete and historical devices of power that put them into practice. These schemes are the condition of historical experience that originate themselves in a certain experience, a relationship with an object X that we will have to locate and describe. Let us first recall that for Kant, we must not confuse the noumenon with the transcendental object X. The noumenon is nothing but limit consciousness. For Kant, true cognition, the knowledge of determinate limits of reason, entails the knowledge of equally determinate limitations, so that he can claim that he must be content with unlimited but solid possession of knowledge. If the noumenon allowed us to establish the limits and possibilities of what Kant calls true cognition, in order to understand the transcendental object X, we have to remember that for Kant, matter does not mean iron or wood or whatever, but matter means what is determinable as such by form in space and time. The X of the transcendental object alludes to what is determinable and could be determinated by form in some other way, by means of the transcendental scheme of imagination. The determinable is thus linked to the plus of indeterminacy, to the possibility of things being determinated otherwise. What is common to the transcendental object and the noumenon is that neither is an object of knowledge. In the case of the noumenon, because we speak of an indeterminate concept. In the case of the transcendental object, because the X alludes to the determinable and not to anything specific. If the noumenon allows us to establish the limits and structural possibilities of human knowledge, the transcendental object X allows us to constitute our system of representations. Let us see how it could work in the light of these historical a priori floating schemes. A historical device of power requires the condensation of a random conjunction of elements of different types and conditions. These elements require a synthesis because they are heterogeneous. If transcendental schematism serves to bridge the distance between the pure concepts of understanding and the intuitions of sensibility, we can see the a priori historical schemes as that which allows the synthesis between indeterminate, informulate impressions, beliefs, affections, etc. This scheme makes possible to articulate them, to link them together, but it is still necessary that the representation structure by the schemes be related to the determinable of an object in general, object X. Like the Kantian transcendental scheme, the a priori historical scheme consists in a sensible transposition, which makes it possible to aim a target. It makes visible what would otherwise remain invisible. The schema transforms the determinable of the object, that X, that paradoxically opens it to indeterminacy, insofar as it means that in it there is a plus that could be determined in different ways, in a concrete presentation. The device of power among the Sunni, in order to designate the target of persecution, must portray it, materialize it, in the figure of the sorcerer boy. According to Kant, the scheme is what provides a concept with its image. It generates for this purpose image schemes, or more precisely, figure schemes, for they are not limited to visual image only, that present the concept, in this case sorcery, by portraying it in a sensible intuition. Let us recall that one of the characteristics of schemas is that they present the concept in a sensible intuition, synthesizing in this case the indetermination present in the heterogeneity of affections and beliefs, and presenting someone effectively as a witch, a sorcerer, an enemy, an opponent. The figuration provided by the scheme is from the outset a prefiguration, a prevision. What verifies the belief is the scheme identificatory function which allows one to recognize past phenomena and to anticipate future phenomena as the same as the present one. By allowing themselves to be identified by the scheme, individuals become mere cases, examples among others, of a general rule ordained by the power devices. However, this condensation of heterogeneous motifs is accompanied by several changes in the target, as it can move from which to which, or from which to migrants, or terrorists, or whatever. A scheme also is a synthetic representation unifying several heterogeneous elements, and is dynamic because it is able to modify itself through association with other representations. Freud considered condensation and displacement as the main unconscious processes of dream work. We see that they characterize as much what we would call the work of the scheme. What is the relationship what links the schemes to the devices of power? Of course, schemes can only act by investing themselves in devices that provide them with the human agents, the techniques and institutions, the knowledge and the legitimizing discourses that enable them to act. But every apparatus is the condensation of an unstable and changing power dynamic. It is born and transformed according to the situation. It disappears and is reconstituted in another form. It presents itself as a variable with a constant, or more precisely, as a variable whose only constant element is the need to deal with the excess and indeterminacy that are the condition of possibility and impossibility of the social field. Without the schemes, the devices cannot capture any effect and remain powerless to act. We can contemplate that the fear of an indeterminacy and an excess that blurs and threatens the sense of identity or belonging sometimes is concentrated in another that threatens to contaminate us, and that mobilizes the opposition of the pure and the impure, that is the haunting of the defilement of the contagion. This panic of contamination is what motivates the acts of sharing, expulsion or enclosure that these devices accomplish, that these acts are inscribed each time in a space, in the borders that the communities draw or the walls that they erect to protect themselves from contagion. The fundamental effect that this scheme mobilizes is disgust, of which contempt is a sublimated form. This effect does not necessarily encourage those who feel it to destroy the object or the disgust. They simply turn away from it, or reject it, or put it aside. When this no longer suffices to overcome the anguish of contagion, when the excluded element reappears as a threat impossible to cast aside, another effect arises that aims to no longer simply to reject, but to annihilate the object of one's dread. Disgust then gives way to hatred, and it is indeed hatred that the persecution schemes mobilize to put it at the service of a device. Other devices bring into play different schemes which mobilize other effects, and it's the same of the counter devices that are molded during crises and revolutions, where the men manage to dissociate themselves from the power of devices. They bring into play schemes of emancipation whose fundamental feeling is, for example, hope. In those situations, we can recall that the schemes give a concept a sensible presentation. For example, the amazing of physical bodies can give a sense of reality to working class ideas or demands that the bourgeois public sphere would like to dismiss as unrealistic or fantastic. It should be noted that one of the reasons why power devices and counter devices are so powerful is because our constitutive ability to resonate with others that we call mimesis. We know that central to COV&R and Autónoma's story is the repression and cooptation of a human capacity for mimesis or constitutive resonance, such that modern humans exile themselves into a position of alienated domination vis-à-vis nature, both external and internal, that allow them to understand the world only insofar as they disavow their magnetic continuity with it. One might add to this story another dimension that is all too frequently forgotten today. Many of the thinkers associated most paradigmatically with the Enlightenment were in fact not so much obsessed with how to master the world from a position of domineering externality, although this is how certain thought often took practical form once it was operationalized by political and commercial bureaucracies. Rather, they remain preoccupied with clear questions of affective resonance and human permeability. In the mid-18th century, David Hume and Adam Smith tried, through notion of sympathy, to work out whether the human propensity from encounter-based mimetic response might be scaled up so as to provide a medium of moral orientation in a modern society of strangers. We have to recall that mimesis, by way of sense of similarity, is easy to grasp the play of likeness, but non-sense of similarity in Walter works, as Miriam Hansen explains, on the order of affinity rather than sameness, identity, copy, or reproduction, and its skilled actualization crucially depends on a third element, the mimetically gifted reader. Non-sense of similarity is what comes alive when Adorno's aesthetic subject yields to the primacy of the object. The point is not just one of attending to objects, in this case, differently. The idea is that through this transformed practice of attention that I would call aesthetic, other resonances of indeterminate impressions become available for actualization in schemes, and other historical potentialities begin to press upon the present, opening up to the possibility of activating similarities and forgotten traces in unsuspected ways. Let us clarify one more point. As Rogozinski points out, it's important to realize we are dealing here with schemes, not concepts or discourse or beliefs. We too often imagine that the misdeeds of a power apparatus can be explained by referring to the doctrine to which it refers, and yet there is nothing in Marx's theories that announces the Gulag. There is nothing in the Gospels or the Quran to account for the Inquisition or Islamic terrorism. To legitimize itself, an apparatus can appropriate any doctrine, but it is never the doctrine that mobilizes and guides its action. It's the scheme that structures it. The phantasms, indeterminate impressions, affects, and mimetic resonance that are associated with it, the effects whose capture and intensification these schemes allow. Conclusion. There is one last thing I would like to point out. We started recalling how the most common gesture of every political program is to identify a problem, locate its cause, and then eliminate that cause to solve the problem. But we cannot foresee that eliminating the problem would also transform the way the elimination itself would later be judged, even by ourselves. The retroactive effects of social relations means that each thing is not exhausted in its current social identity, but that there always remains in them a plus of determinacy, that X of every object. And precisely for that reason, they can signify in new ways, and for that reason, we have schemes. To the Declaration of Human Rights, it is the same emancipatory project, the same aim of a universal community that crosses the entire history of the West. No doubt, it has become difficult for us to share enthusiasm and faith in progress. Hegel had already sensed it while meditating on the terror, and the bloody history of the 20th and 21st century confirmed. This universal emancipation project does not only come up against external obstacles, indeed, it is its own dynamics that led it to betray its idea, to realize itself as the opposite of itself through a series of catastrophic reversals. By refusing to recognize the persistence of the excess, the plus of indeterminacy and the ambivalence, By dissociating in an increasingly clear manner its subject and sublime figures, we have favored the demonization of people and the exclusion, stigmatization, and designation of absolute enemies condemned to extermination. To overcome hatred, truth is necessary. Not the truth of Levi-Strauss that seeks the satisfaction of the community with itself. The truth of the blues of indeterminacy must be revealed to us in this hierarchy of identities and identification. It must reveal to us so that we can recognize it with compassion and responsibility as the flesh of our flesh, our doomed part, our obscure background, our openness and our potentiality, and what different from each of us and identical to each of us. I think we need this, a performative truth that does not let itself be locked up in any doctrine or any statement because it is not distinguished from its self-revelation. Thank you very much.
So, I'd like to introduce to you the second lecturer of this morning, Geoff Shullenberger. Geoff Shullenberger is managing editor of Compact, an online magazine founded in 2022, and co-host of the Blame Theory podcast. He was previously clinical associate professor of expository writing at New York University and has also taught at California State University, Monterey Bay, and Brown University. He holds a PhD in comparative literature from Brown University and an MA in literature from Oxford University. He is co-editor of COVID-19 and The Left, The Tyranny of Fear, published by Routledge in 2024. He contributes regularly to publications including American Affairs, The Chronicle of Higher Education, City Journal, First Things, The New Atlantis, Tablet, and Unheard. Very welcome to Geoff Shullenberger.
Just to start, I'd like to say thanks to Andreas Films, because the thing that motivated me to continue what was initially just a kind of brief exploration of the connection between Girard and Foucault was motivated by his invitation to me to contribute to the second volume of René Girard in the Western Philosophical Tradition, the first volume of which I believe is being presented after this. This is a version of what I hope will ultimately be my contribution to the second volume of that. And as it happens, as you'll see, when I first started this exploration, I didn't have Benoit Chante's biography, but it's contributed a great deal to exploring this connection. So that was fortuitous, as it turned out. So, in February of 1972, Michel Foucault sat down with a group of Maoist militants to discuss the subject of popular justice. The occasion was the radical left's effort to convene popular tribunals that would put the ruling class and its representatives on trial for crimes committed against the people that went unprosecuted. In 1970, Jean-Paul Sartre himself had presided over one such tribunal in the town of Lens, where the owners of the mine were symbolically tried in absentia for the death of 16 workers. According to Foucault's biographer James Miller, the subterranean motive that led some in the Maoist faction to convene the conversation with him was an unease with where these tribunals seemed to be going. This is the period in which left-wing terrorism was on the rise in Europe, and arguments for people's justice then in vogue in French Maoist circles might easily be used to justify the kinds of kidnappings and executions undertaken by groups like the Baader-Meinhof gang. The most radical faction of the Maoists was led by Denis Lévy, the firebrand leader of the 1968 revolt who later became Sartre's personal secretary. Some of Lévy's increasingly uneasy compatriots regarded the dialogue with Foucault as an opportunity to subject the spiraling tendency towards violent direct action to critical scrutiny. This proved to be the case, but not quite as they expected. Foucault's main objection to the Maoists, it already became clear in the opening exchange of the discussion, was that they weren't going far enough. Insofar as they attempted to replicate in the people's tribunals something like the form of a court, the philosopher argued these aspiring revolutionaries would only betray the spirit of popular justice, since the court's historical function is to ensnare it, to control it and strangle it by reinscribing it within institutions typical of a state apparatus. Foucault illustrated this assertion with reference to the September massacres of 1792, in which mobs stormed prisons in and around Paris, summarily executing accused class traitors and anti-revolutionary conspirators en masse. This is not usually recalled as one of the prouder moments of the French Revolution, but Foucault attempted to vindicate it as, quote, a response to oppression strategically effective and politically necessary, end quote. Foucault's primary aim, however, wasn't to justify the killings. People's justice, per se, was taken as needing no further justification by him and his interlocutors alike. Instead, he aimed to show that the spontaneous mob actions were fatally compromised when men from the Paris Commune, quote, intervened and set about staging a court, judges behind a table representing a third party standing between people who were screaming for vengeance and the accused who were either guilty or innocent, end quote. Foucault then asked his interlocutors, quote, is not the setting up of a neutral institution standing between the people and its enemies, is this not a way of resisting popular justice, end quote. Throughout the discussion that followed, Lévy repeatedly raised counterexamples from Mao's China that he claimed differed from Foucault's examples drawn from bourgeois revolutions, in which an institutional structure is set up to direct popular justice. Foucault repeatedly demurred, acknowledging his unfamiliarity with the contemporaneous Chinese situation in most of the years of the Cultural Revolution. And he continued to insist that the erection of any purportedly neutral institutional structure risked betraying the enterprise of people's justice by channeling it into institutional forms whose neutrality was a facade for agendas inimical to the entire project, which would only ensure that popular energies were ultimately recontained. So what did Foucault see as the alternative to a people's court? Freed of institutional constraints, he claimed popular justice could take on different forms. Quote, a certain number of ancient rights which were features of prejudicial justice have been preserved in the practices of popular justice. For example, it was an old Germanic custom to put the head of an enemy on a stake for public viewing, end quote. The head of the governor in Yébenes was paraded around the captured Bastille, around the symbol of the repressive state apparatus revolves with its ancient ancestral rights, a popular practice which did not identify itself in any way with judicial institutions, end quote. Such instances of spontaneous revolts, he argued, revealed that, quote, in the case of popular justice, you do not have three elements, in other words, the tripartite legal structure of two conflicting parties and a neutral judge. You have the, quote, the masses and their enemies. Lévy, who, according to Miller, was baffled to discover himself outflanked on the left by the 46-year-old philosopher, eventually turned from Mao's China to more recent French history to re-articulate his case for some sort of institutional mediation in the pursuit of popular justice. He cited the so-called épuration sauvage that occurred during the liberation of France in 1944, when, among others, women accused of consorting with Nazis were publicly humiliated, their heads shaved, some branded with hot irons, after which they were marched around, taunted, and publicly abused. This is an ambiguous act of popular justice, Lévy argued, because, quote, while the people were being entertained by shaving the heads of the women, the real collaborators, the real traitors were getting away, end quote. The lesson, as he saw it, was that, quote, if mass movement is not given proletarian unity and direction, it can disintegrate from within and be exploited by the class enemy. Foucault remained impervious to this objection, insisting, quote, the masses will discover ways of dealing with the problem of their enemies without involving the form of the court, which is to be avoided, end quote. Despite these differences, a few weeks later, Foucault joined the Maoists to protest the fatal shooting of a laid-off worker by a security guard in an auto plant. The subsequent confrontation with the police turned violent, and witnesses later reported seeing the philosopher beaten with a truncheon. In the subsequent week, a group of Maoists kidnapped a Mao executive, but unlike their German and Italian counterparts in this period, they ended up balking and crossing over into murder, and they released the executive unharmed in the end. It's customary to remember Foucault as a man of the radical left in his intervention in this dialogue as a passionate advocate of the most savage forms of popular justice would seem to support this conclusion. Miller's biography, however, encourages us to view his advocacy in a different light. First of all, Foucault's engagement with radical left politics was relatively belated and short-lived. During his early career, a period in which Sartre's Marxist existentialism reigned supreme, quote, left-wing intellectuals, I'm quoting from Miller's biography here, took Foucault to be a rather conventional, even conservative academic Mandarin. Moreover, Foucault was a critic of what he saw as the stifling influence of the French Communist Party, which he had briefly joined as a young man, only to leave it in reaction to some of what was unfolding in the Soviet Union. And Foucault's opposition to Soviet-style communism extended all the way from his early break with the PCF to his stint in Warsaw in the late 1950s, to finally his avid support of solidarity and Eastern European dissidents in the 70s and 80s. In Miller's account, it was Foucault's encounter with Tunisian student rebels while he was living and teaching in the North African country in the late 60s, and then the subsequent events of May 68, although he was still in Tunisia when they occurred. These were what ultimately precipitated his period of most radical agitation. What shifted at this point, according to Miller, was not so much his ideological outlook as his realization that political action could play a part in what he called, in the preface to the History of Madness, his, quote, great Nietzschean quest, and for what he called undifferentiated experience, which his scholarship had sought out in the phenomena society kept in its margins: madness, criminality, sexual deviance, and so on. In these spaces, Foucault saw, as Miller puts it, quote, an unholy revelation of the human being in its unformed Dionysian essence, end quote. It was in Tunisia in early 1968 that Foucault had, in Miller's words, quote, his first inkling that politics, like art and eroticism, could occasion a kind of lived experience. In other words, Foucault's enthusiasm for revolutionary violence in the years after 1968 were another manifestation of what Miller calls his Sado-Nietzschean views, derived above all from the works of Georges Bataille. As Miller notes, quote, an ominously similar kind of logic had led a number of fascist and Nazi philosophers, also intoxicated by fantasies of Dionysian revolt, to condone savage displays of violence, in some cases calling for total war, end quote, referring to the early 20th century. The rehabilitation of Nietzsche after he seemed to provide intellectual cover for the Nazis in the 1930s and 40s had relied on a certain depoliticization of his work. First, he became an existentialist psychologist in the work of the émigré translator Walter Kaufmann, and then for the French philosophers of the 1960s, including Foucault, he became a master debunker of the Western philosophical tradition and an apostle of radical self-reinvention and transformation. But the repoliticization of Nietzsche in the wake of the 1968 revolts revived the specter of political violence previously associated with his name. In May 1972, Foucault's advocacy for the extrajudicial elimination of class enemies was put to test by events in the town of Brunet-en-Artois, where a working-class teenage girl was brutally murdered. A prominent attorney in the town was initially charged with murder. The charges were then dropped. The Maoists seized on this case as an instance of where popular justice was needed, made necessary by the failure of the state to prosecute a crime against the working class. Denis Levy led the charge, writing in a Maoist newspaper, quote, it is difficult to attack the authority of a class without a few heads belonging to members of this class being paraded on the end of a stake. So here he seemed to be echoing directly Foucault's intervention in the dialogue a few months earlier that they had. Faced with the opportunity to put his arguments into practice, Foucault visited Bruet to meet with Levy and the other militants, but he ended up declining to make public statements about the affair, and by some accounts wavered in private as to the guilt of the accused man. May 1972, the month of this incident and the agitation around it, was, as it happens, also the month when Girard's Violence of the Sacred was published by Grasset. Although the book is written mostly to remove from any contemporary political context of the sort I've been discussing, focusing instead on the ancient world and primitive societies, its composition was partly motivated by the spiraling violence in the era in which the author was living, year of Vietnam and liberation struggles, of riots and terrorism on both sides of the Atlantic, and of the unraveling of the social order erected in the wake of the Second World War. Indeed, the pattern of the festival gone wrong, central to Girard's book, could be seen in the trajectory of leftist politics in Europe in the period from the carnivalesque collective effervescence of 1968 to the murderous violence French Maoists were flirting with, even as radicals in other countries were plunging headlong into it. Despite Girard's distance from the militancy of Foucault and Levy, who were more concerned with left-wing political tactics than grand theoretical questions at the time, already in the book's first chapter, he covers much of the same ground explored in their dialogue in February of the same year. Much of the discussion there, recalled, revolved around the distinction between purely private revenge and acts of vengeance that form part of a political project. On these grounds, Levy told Foucault that there must be an institutional third party. In the case of China, he cited the army as the third party, was serving the third party, according to him, in the people's justice being carried out in the Cultural Revolution. So Levy insisted on the need of a third party to guarantee that the pursuit of popular justice didn't collapse into private vendettas, stating that, quote, it has to be decided that this particular execution or that particular act of vengeance is not simply a matter of an individual settling of accounts, that is purely and simply egotistical revenge. In Violence and the Sacred, Girard draws the same distinction. Quote, once the concept of interminable revenge has been formally rejected, it is referred to as private vengeance. The term implies the existence of a public vengeance, a counterpart never made explicit. By definition, primitive societies have only private vengeance. Public vengeance is the exclusive property of well-policed societies, and our society calls it the judicial system. The Maoists, despite their enthusiasm for popular justice, were concerned about its potential devolution into egotistical revenge. Their ostensible reason for this worry was that private pursuits threatened to derail the political aims of the movement. But perhaps their enemies also expressed a more primal anxiety. The fear of vengeance as an interminable, infinitely repetitive process that ultimately threatens to consume the entire social body rather than bring justice to it. As it happens, more or less this happened in Levy's model nation of the People's Republic of China in the 1970s. Girard's phrasing might be Levy's in his, Girard, one of Girard's phrasing echoes Levy's in his admonitions to Foucault. Quote, as long as there exists no sovereign and independent body capable of taking the place of the injured party and taking upon itself the responsibility for revenge, the danger of interminable escalation remains. Foucault, as we have seen, was unfazed by this sort of objection. What concerned him, on the contrary, was the opposite, the danger of a sovereign and independent body, which in the form of the court is embodied in the figure of the judge, itself functioning as the covert agent of another sort of private vengeance, namely the vengeance of the ruling class against those who have challenged it. Note that such a prospect is at least hinted at in Girard's equation of the judicial system with what he calls public vengeance. In other words, Girard makes no absolute moral distinction between blood feud and judicial punishment, merely a functional one. As he says, quote, our judicial system does not suppress vengeance, rather it effectively limits it to a single act of reprisal, enacted by a sovereign authority specializing in this particular function. The decisions of the judiciary are invariably presented as the final word on vengeance. Girard also observes the same ideological concealment that interests Foucault, above all when he notes that for public vengeance to serve the function of ending the cycle of reciprocal violence, its identity must never be made explicit. Its identity as vengeance must never be made explicit. Here we might think of the figure of a hooded executioner whose identity must be disguised precisely because his individuality must be absorbed fully into the apparatus he serves. An executioner possessed of an individual identity might become the target of a reprisal, bringing about the resurgence of private revenge. Foucault again takes the opposite tack. His concern is with the resurgence amid a process of popular justice of something resembling the judicial system, of what he calls a third party, and Girard calls a superior tribunal. Crucially, Foucault is not thinking in terms of individuals or kinship units, but social classes, the people in the ruling class. Since such a tribunal will always be de facto the private instrument of the latter's power, its neutrality is for him a sham. The examples furnished by Girard come from ethnographies and ancient literature, whereas Foucault's historical examples come largely from the late Middle Ages onward, and especially the French Revolution. Moreover, Girard is usually referring to conflicts between aggrieved kinship groups. But as we've seen, what Foucault regards as most important in displays of popular justice are the traces of what he refers to as, quote, old Germanic custom and ancient ancestral rights, end quote. In other words, he regards the alternative to court-mediated people's justice as emerging out of and reflecting a collective memory of social realities that long predate the emergence of anything like a modern class structure. His confidence that, quote, the masses will discover a way of dealing with the problem of their enemies without involving the court, end quote, is grounded not in a Marxian confidence that the proletariat represents the most advanced social sector, but on the contrary in a primitivist conviction that the masses have more ancient resources to draw on, resources that he presents as ritual in nature, in distinction with bureaucratic justice. Violence in the Sacred provides ample support for this assumption, albeit not in a way that would offer much encouragement for Foucault's political enthusiasms in this period. For Girard, ancient ancestral rights are simply the ritualized form of the many-on-one violence carried out by mobs. So to what extent did Foucault, when he obtained a copy of Girard's book upon its release in the early summer of 1972, recognize the link between its content and contemporary political controversies in which he was embroiled, not least the one in Boulet, in which the practical advisability of carrying out a lynching was being hotly debated by his political associates. We will never know for certain, but we do now know, thanks to Benoît Chante's biography, that Foucault did read Violence in the Sacred in the exact period the Brouet affair was unfolding. We know this because Girard received a letter in early July in which Foucault praised his book effusively. So we can only speculate here, but it is hard to imagine that Foucault could have read Violence in the Sacred, as he says, quote, slowly, meticulously, sentence by sentence, end quote, without occasionally feeling alluded to and even detecting an indirect rebuke. We also know from Chante's biography that when Girard and Foucault coincided during the latter's first stint at Buffalo in 1970, the same year the former began composing Violence in the Sacred, they discussed Euripides' The Bacchae. In March, between Foucault's dialogue with the Maoists and the release of Girard's book, the two were again together in Buffalo, when Foucault reprised his role as a visiting lecturer. The Euripides play came up again during one of the lectures. So when we read in Violence in the Sacred, quote, only the quixotic masochism of our own age, the result of a long immunity to the violence that threatens primitive societies, allows us to see anything attractive in the Dionysus of the Bacchae. We might ask whether Girard might have had this interlocutor in mind, as well as whether Foucault might have asked himself the same question as he read this line. On a similar note, consider the following remark about Georges Bataille, a key point of reference for Foucault and also for Girard. Quote, Bataille is primarily inclined to treat violence in terms of some rare and precious condiment, the only spice still capable of stimulating the jaded appetites of modern man. This description applies to the woozy militantism on display in Foucault's dialogue with the Maoists. Or consider one of the more sententious formulations in Violence in the Sacred. Quote, Dionysus is the god of decisive mob action. End quote. Foucault's great Nietzschean quest was an extended pursuit of, as Miller describes it, quote, the Dionysian impulse. It is hardly surprising in light of Girard's line of argument in Violence in the Sacred that in a certain period of his career, Foucault took this vocation in the direction of advocating decisive mob action, or as he called it, people's justice. The shared preoccupation of Girard and Foucault, as the latter remarked in Buffalo at one point, according to Chante's biography, was the great question of exclusion. Girard's writing of Violence in the Sacred, from Violence in the Sacred onward, made the case that all institutions have their root in the sacrificial violence by which archaic societies restored social peace. Foucault, for his part, focused his writing on the founding exclusions of modern liberal societies and their institutions, the ways that certain groups, the insane, prisoners, sexual deviants, functioned as permanent exceptions to the rights and freedoms these societies granted. His work exposed the violence secreted within ostensibly humane institutions such as the asylum and the prison, particularly in their most ostensibly humane manifestations. We'll never know what might have come of the public dialogue between Girard and Foucault on Nietzsche, Bataille, Dionysus, the violence of institutions, and other overlapping interests. We do have instead an indirect debate in form of Girard's polemic against Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, whose work of gonzo philosophy, Anti-Oedipus, appeared the same year as Violence of the Sacred, with a celebratory preface from Foucault. Despite differences in style and approach, the two books covered overlapping ground, both offering critiques of Freud's Oedipus complex and elaborating novel theories of desire that aim to supplant the Freudian one. It was Anti-Oedipus, though, that by tapping into the militant revolutionary mood that persisted post-1968 that made the bigger splash. Girard, apparently conscious of the dynamic and intellectual rivalry at play, which, if you read the letter included in Chantal's biography, Foucault sort of makes explicit by juxtaposing Deleuze and Girard as two alternative paths of thought. I won't be able to go into that further at the moment. But in any case, Girard, apparently conscious of this rivalry between himself and Deleuze, between Violence of the Sacred and Anti-Oedipus, launched a grenade against what he described as the dubious audacities of Deleuzian delirium, with his essay, Delirium as System, published in the journal Critique later in 1972. His argument was that Anti-Oedipus was a document not of revolutionary vitality, but of decadence and exhaustion. The dying man, Girard writes towards the end of the essay, quote, can only appeal to the last signs of his own life, that is, the convulsions belying death, but whose violence quickens its arrival. End quote. So with the critique of Bataille noted and quoted above, Girard's argument echoes Nietzsche's account of enervated modern man's quest for stimulants strong enough to awaken him from his stupefaction. But whereas Nietzsche held out the possibility that some such substances might ultimately be found, a prospect that entranced Foucault and Deleuze alike, for Girard this entire pursuit was a distraction from the real crisis of modernity, namely, quote, how to survive without prohibitions, without sacrificial recognition, without scapegoat victims. This is the real problem, and it is in order to avoid confronting it that our modern rituals of rebellion are perpetuated. End quote. In imagining delusionally the gestures of transgression, or perhaps decisive mob action, might shatter the stasis of a stalled-out modernity, radicals like Deleuze and Foucault were merely reenacting a conventional script of modern life. According to Chantal, Foucault was put off by Girard's attack on his friend Deleuze, but nevertheless remained friendly and open to further dialogue in their brief and sporadic later encounters. In the meantime, though, Foucault himself grew more distant from Deleuze and from the latter radical left as the 1970s wore on, regardless of whether Foucault's critiques of Dionysian politics played any role in this shift. I think it's possible. On the other hand, we should also note, and I'll come back to this at the end, that Foucault's final and most notorious political enthusiasm for the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran reprised many of the themes of his earlier flirtations with Maoist militancy, although with a crucial difference. Foolishly or not, he saw the promise of the revolution and its grounding in a religious faith and its traditions. Moving on from that, Girard's question in Delirium as System, which I quoted above, how to survive without prohibitions, without sacrificial misrecognition, without scapegoat victims, is, regardless of any influence that we might be able to trace or not between them, one that did in fact guide Foucault's work through the rest of his intellectual trajectory. The question, how to survive without prohibitions, is in a sense the central one guiding the history of sexuality, although Foucault phrases it differently. Quote, how, if not by way of prohibition and blockage, does power gain access to sexuality? In other words, if we take sexuality as one of the realms of Dionysus that threatens to destabilize the social order, how does a permissive society, one that ceases to regulate sexuality through taboo, keep this threat at bay? In the history of sexuality, not unlike Girard, Foucault takes aim at what he calls the repressive hypothesis, that is, the idea that modern society still labors under stifling prohibitions that block the full realization of our desires. If history of sexuality is Foucault's extended answer to the question of how society can survive without prohibitions, Discipline and Punish is his answer to the question of how society survives without sacrificial misrecognition and without scapegoat victims. This book's celebrated opening chapter, The Body of the Condemned, recounts the gruesome public execution of the regicide Zenia in 1757, and shows that this marked a late manifestation of a mode of punishment that subsequently fell into disrepute, the public torture and execution of criminals. Such practices, Girard's work would suggest, have their roots in universal sacrificial rights, the same ancient rights to which Foucault alluded when recalling the mob that stormed the Bastille. Moreover, as Miller notes, Foucault's prose in the opening section of Discipline and Punish, quote, invites the reader to contemplate with unwanted sympathy the cruel power at play in the splendor and explosive glory of death by torture, end quote. In his rapt description of horrific violence, as in his paeans to popular justice, the philosopher's fascination with lived experiences remains fundamental to his Dionysian politics. In the decades after Zenia was executed under the influence of innumerable projects of reform, such practices came to be regarded as a barbaric relic, a phase in the gradual discrediting of sacrificial violence, highlighted by Girard. But as Foucault shows, the abandonment of these brutal spectacles of violence gave rise to a new penal style, which concealed the workings of punishment in rationally planned prisons and focused on reforming the soul rather than torturing and killing the body. This then is Foucault's answer to how we survive without scapegoat victims. In a sense, we don't. There are still victims, but they are no longer they're simply no longer subjected to public immolation. Instead, they are secreted away into diffuse, mostly invisible operations of power. It was precisely this insight that Girard praised in 1996 in When These Things Begin, where he refers explicitly to what he regards as, quote, the value of Foucault's work, as having shown that if you stamp out sacrificial mechanisms here, they pop up over again there. End quote. He goes on to say, quote, Foucault understood the very thing that optimistic rationalism didn't foresee. New forms of victimization are constantly emerging from the instruments that were intended to do away with them. In this, end quote. In this regard, Foucault's work also shows to some extent how we survive without sacrificial misrecognition by way, in part, of new forms of misrecognition, as Girard's remark hints. The shift towards modern forms of punishment obscures the logic of unanimous violence, which becomes intolerable due to the discrediting of sacrifice, even as it covertly maintains this logic. Girard suggests in Violence in the Sacred that sacrifice has been replaced by the mechanisms of the judicial system. The argument of Discipline and Punish, complements this account by showing the persistence of victimization of the more humane apparatuses of modern societies. If we accept Girard's claim that all institutions evolve directly or indirectly from the sacrificial cult, Foucault's conclusion isn't surprising. Perhaps, like evolved organisms, they carry the vestigial traces of the entities that preceded them. Just this was at stake in Foucault's dialogue with the malice, in which he targeted the misrecognition implicit in the form of the court. If the neutrality of the third party or judge is a mask for the arbitrary violence of the ruling class against those who challenge it, perhaps it would be better, Foucault at least flirts with this idea, to revive the sacrificial misrecognition of ancient rights. This, of course, is where Girard and Foucault part ways, unless we see the substitution of blood sacrifice with the operations of the judicial system, however flawed and compromised, as part of humanity's broader attempt to renounce its own violence, we are likely to share in Foucault's temptations. Girard frequently noted that in the post-sacrificial world, quote, one can only persecute persecutors. You have to prove that your opponent is a persecutor in order to justify your own desire to persecute. In the history of sexuality, in his late lectures at the Collège de France, Foucault advanced a related argument. Power has shifted its emphasis from raking down and violent death on its enemies, as we saw before with the example of the regicide Zenia, to preserving and safeguarding the life of its population. For a long time, Foucault notes in the first volume of the History of Sexuality, quote, one of the characteristic privileges of sovereign power was the right to decide life and death, end quote, but just as in post-sacrificial societies, an accusation of scapegoating can only be legitimately deployed against those accused of scapegoating. Under the sign of what Foucault called biopolitics, one had the right, quote, to kill those who represented a kind of biological threat to others. This would suggest that we should trace the rise of biopolitics, the mode of power that legitimates itself as a force for protecting and preserving life, to the concern for victims, which Girard sees as the cultural force that undermines the functioning of sacrifice. In this sense, bringing together Girardian and Foucauldian analyses might help us to develop more granular accounts of the post-sacrificial evolution of power away from its foundation in many on more violence and towards institutional forms and social practices that attempt to manage violence in different ways. Like sacrifice, this new regime contains violence in both senses of the word. The series of lectures delivered by Foucault under the title The Birth of Biopolitics elaborate the thesis of, quote, the consequence of liberalism and the thesis that, quote, the consequence of liberalism and the liberal art of government is the considerable extension of procedures of control, constraint, and coercion, which are something like the counterpart and counterweights of different freedoms. For Foucault, what made the freedoms of the modern self conceivable was the internalization of the disciplines facilitated by the diffuse panoptic gaze of power. Girard came to a similar conclusion, stating, quote, nowadays there is a stability which is no longer based on dharma. Parenthetically, by this he means the external mediation facilitated by hierarchical structures. Returning to his quote, and which must inevitably be based on the Judeo-Christian principle of the individual who dominates his own violent impulses. As a result, certain fields function according to objective laws, even in the human realms, and these laws prevent mimetic escalations, as in the case of economic competition and the market economy. It is notable that for Foucault, too, the operations of the market play a central role in the post-sacrificial regime, stating in his lectures on biopolitics that, quote, economic freedom and disciplinary techniques are completely bound up with one another, quote. Girard's later writings and interviews often alternate between an understanding of market relations as a relatively nonviolent conduit for mimetic rivalry and an apocalyptic mood of the sort expressed in evolution and conversion, for example. Quote, after the decomposition of the sacrificial order, there's nothing standing between ourselves and our possible destruction. End quote. And yet Girard also indicates that there isn't quite nothing standing between us and this. Both the judicial apparatus and the market economy, as we have seen, are stabilizing elements in a prolonged interregnum. Girard paid relatively scant attention to the institutions that prevail within this interregnum. The post-sacrificial means by which Dionysus is kept at bay, or is precisely this as the central concern of Foucault's entire body of writing. To this extent, again, their work can be viewed as potentially complementary. But of course, one shouldn't overstate the harmony between their views. Girard described his own worldview as Nietzscheism in reverse. That is, he shared with Nietzsche the conclusion that the Christian revolution in values, by which the single victim mechanism of social pacification was undermined, was the irreversible pivot point of human history. But he saw Nietzsche's fantasy of overcoming this moral revolution through the elevation of the overman as both monstrous and futile, as the Nazis' horrifying travesty of the philosopher had made clear once and for all. Like Girard, Foucault is interested in what becomes of violence once its spectacular cathartic exercise through collective victimization is discredited and abandoned. But concerned as he was with how overt sacrificial cruelty was displaced into the subtle modern operations of power, he was periodically intoxicated by the allure of the Dionysiac mob, even going so far as we've seen to advocate lynching as the only authentic politics before seemingly thinking better. This tendency would seem to make Foucault not merely a case study of the same temptations of modern thought that also allured Nietzsche, Bataille, Deleuze, and others, but a key avatar of what Girard calls the other totalitarianism, which he argued had come to pose an even greater threat than Nazism in the post-war era. Unlike the latter, which had adopted from Nietzsche the imperative to overturn the concern for victims, this other totalitarianism, quote, does not openly oppose Christianity, but outflanks it on its left wing with reproaching it for not defending victims with enough ardor, thus imitating Christianity in the spirit of rivalry, end quote. After all, Foucault pursued his Nietzschean quest to resuscitate Dionysus in combination with advocacy for the marginalized, delinquents, prisoners, sexual deviants, the insane, and so on, and with condemnations of modern society, especially in its most apparently humane aspects. A few years ago, New York Times columnist Ross Douthat proposed that we view Foucault as a satanic figure in the sense of a skeptical accuser, like the Satan who appears in the book of Job, ready to point the finger at the cracks, cruelties, and hypocrisies in any righteous order, to deconstruct any system of power that claims to have truth and virtue on its side. Those on the political right and center who revile Foucault see him in much the same manner, a satanic ringleader, or at least a satanic ringleader who incited the mob they fear is now tearing down all of Western civilization. But here the Girardian can't help but note that Foucault has often come to play the role of a scapegoat in a certain contemporary right-wing mythology or demonology. Consider the credulity with which unseemly rumors about his sexual proclivities have often been accepted by his critics who are not satisfied with debunking his ideas, but determined instead to construe him as a wicked violator of taboos with recourse to stereotypes of persecution familiar to any reader of Girard. Foucault's death from AIDS, around which unverified allegations long swirled that he deliberately infected his sexual partners, offer the perfect metaphor for this mythical status as a vector of intellectual plague. In such accounts, Foucault becomes an Oedipus figure, a brilliant but malevolent foreign super-spreader who must be purged in order for civilization to be purified. By attaching himself to the Dionysian outsiders of modern life, Foucault, in a certain sense, invited this fate. Nonetheless, it's noteworthy that despite the chasm that separated them, Girard did not join the crowd in denouncing his one-time colleague. Instead, he commented appreciatively at various points in his work on Foucault's documentation of the victimization embedded in institutions that posit themselves as humane successors of the old sacrificial regime. Where the two differ, as was also the case with Girard and Nietzsche, is in the interpretation of the meaning of such revelations. Girard himself put their difference this way: it's Foucault's pessimism that separates us. Unlike him, I think that historical processes have meaning, and that we have to accept this, or else we face utter despair. Girard further notes, quote, after the end of ideologies, the only way to embrace this meaning is to rediscover religion, end quote. An unexpected confirmation at this point comes from the divergent trajectories of Foucault and his interlocutor in the dialogue I discussed at the outset, Benny Levy, the fiery advocate of what he later came to describe as libidinal Marxism and joyous immoralism. Over the course of the 1970s, Levy gradually renounced the radical left and embraced Orthodox Judaism, in just over a decade traversing a path from Mount to Moses, as he put it. Foucault, for his part, never experienced a decisive conversion. Nonetheless, in his aforementioned infatuation with the Iranian Revolution, which he differentiated from other modern revolutions precisely in its religious foundations, he took part at this peripherally religious turn of the era. When this final political enthusiasm was disappointed, however, what was left of Foucault were the Dionysian pursuits he belatedly discovered in California, LSD in Death Valley and the bathhouses of San Francisco. These were soon followed by the ultimate limit experience, his death, which as it happens occurred exactly 40 years and 3 days ago. Girard wrote of Nietzsche that, quote, his greatness is that he committed himself totally to Dionysus, and he paid for this commitment literally with his life. End quote. It's an ambiguous but powerful tribute that I believe also could apply to Foucault.